Hi, welcome back. Today I'm going to talk to you about the anthropocentric versus eschatological thesis of art history. You probably want to consult the notes that I have posted on Blackboard along with this video. The anthropocentric versus eschatological thesis suggests that works of art are expressive of one or the other of two main attitudes or philosophies or worldviews, the anthropocentric and the eschatological. Anthropocentric, from the Greek words for man-centered, emphasizes empirical or perceptual experience and human rationality. It sees human beings as the summit or apex of the world, and understands human beings to be able to control or determine their own destiny, especially through their use of reason. This view reflects the humanistic philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome, which comes, as you might remember, from the classical period, circa 450 BC to around AD 300, close to the fall of the Roman Empire. First the Greeks, then the Romans, adopted the philosophy that human beings have a rational nature by which they are able to perfect themselves. This philosophy might be summed up in the motto of the philosopher Protagoras: man is the measure of all things. This ideal was embodied especially in Greek statuary, which sought to present the ideal and perfected human body. The eschatological view, on the other hand, reflects a religious or spiritual perspective. Eschatology is the theology that concerns what happens to human beings after death, or the end of the world, namely judgment and heaven or hell. The eschatological perspective emphasizes that there is more to the world than meets the eye, literally speaking. There is an unseen spiritual dimension which interacts with, affects, and even determines our experience in the physical world. Human beings are fallible and in need of salvation or guidance to escape from their earthly condition. The thesis states that works of art which reflect the anthropocentric perspective show the world as it appears to human beings in terms of both perception, as we see on the left with the Riachi bronze, and also according to our rational knowledge. It exemplifies the ways in which we can organize and understand our experience. The eschatological perspective, exemplified in the work on the right, is unconcerned with the here and now and looks forward to a world to come. Therefore, it is uninterested in the appearances of things, but instead tries to place human experience within the context of larger divine or religious contexts. I want to look at these two ideas in relation to several works of art in examples of painting, mosaic, sculpture, and architecture, and I'm going to weave into this discussion some discussion of Roman and Byzantine art and architecture. If we look, first of all, at this contrast between cave paintings from Lascaux and Roman wall paintings, we can see, broadly speaking, how these two theses might govern the works of art. The Roman wall painting on the left uses perspective to create an illusion of three-dimensional space in the form of a cityscape. And even though this perspective is not totally developed as it would be in the Renaissance, it's still pretty effective at creating a sense of deep space and the suggestion of a window that we can look out of to take in the view. Cave painting, on the other hand, although it uses some modeling and shading to create a sense of three dimensions, it does not attempt to create a window which the viewer is looking through. These animals, seen in the painting at the right, do not occupy the same space. They overlap each other. They only show parts of the bodies, just heads. And all the groups of animals do not interact with each other to create a single coherent scene. In fact, the paintings on the cave wall were even made years, even millennia apart by different artists, so there is no attempt to create a single coherent image. The Romans in their paintings continued the illusionistic paintings pioneered by the Greeks. Everyday subjects like still lives and portraits were some of their main concerns. This still life, seen here, also employs illusionistic techniques, like in the landscape in the previous slide. This is called trompe l'oeil, which means fool the eye. There is a palpable sense of three-dimensional space and a definite but limited kind of perspective in the ledge on which the fruit sits. The painting is an extension in time and space of the viewer's world. It is almost as if the viewer had just picked up a piece of fruit, bitten it, and placed it back down on the ledge. The point of the painting is to delight the viewer with a sense of immediacy created through painterly illusionism. Roman portraits are used to convey the specific likenesses of individuals. The details give them this individuality. The wife holds a stylus and a tablet on which she would use to make notes, and the husband holds a scroll. Again, there is a real sense of three dimensions in this painting. Their anatomy is properly described, as are details like hair and the folds of clothing, and there is a suggestion of contrapposto. Both the husband and wife have their heads slightly turned, and their eyes meet the viewers as if they have just looked up to greet us. This gives a subtle but definite sense of liveliness. They look at us, engaging our space in a similar way to the previous still life. In the same way, the Romans used mosaics for visual delight. The Romans often used mosaics as a kind of floor decoration, and here the mosaicist creates an illusionistic tour de force on the floor of a dining room. Again, the pictorial space is conceived as an imaginative extension of the viewer's space. The mosaic contains the remains of a feast. We see bits of bone and vegetables and seashells and other kinds of things, chicken legs, all of these things that would have been discarded by the diners at this feast and left to be swept up the following morning by the homeowner's servants. The purpose is to create an illusion that is simply meant for our delight and pleasure. By contrast, the early Christian and Byzantine use of mosaic is very different. Mosaics in the early Christian period were taken off the floor and placed on the wall. They were concerned with both the splendor of the medium as well as its permanence. The early Christians and the Byzantines made their mosaics using bits of stone, like the Romans, but they also often preferred to use tesserae, which are what the little mosaic tiles are called, that were made out of glass, and sometimes these would be backed with gold. And you can see this especially in the background here, behind the heads of the figures in this mosaic. All of that is gold, and what that means is that the mosaic would shimmer as you move around it, because the facets of the tesserae would catch the light, creating a very splendid effect. The early Christian and Byzantine art gradually lost interest in portraying specific likenesses as well. Unlike the Roman portrait we saw a couple slides ago, these figures are types, they are not individuals. The space is flat and compressed, and the figures are pressed uncomfortably close to each other, and yet, mysteriously, they don't feel crowded. The Emperor Justinian, who's shown in purple in the center, and Maximianus, his bishop, shown to his left, our right, even step on on people's toes, the people in their retinue. But no one seems to feel any pain. Their bodies are elongated and insubstantial, even ethereal. These are not physical beings, they are spiritualized beings. They do not have solid, robust, and well-defined anatomies as seen in classical Greek and Roman statuary. Even though they are supposed to be walking, and this mosaic would be part of a decoration program in the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna that was supposed to model the Eucharistic procession, Justinian is shown holding the paten, on which the Eucharistic bread would be held, that would be brought up to the altar for the Mass. So even though they're supposed to be walking up towards the altar, their bodies are stiff and convey little to no movement, and there is no sense of spatial recession as we see in Roman mosaics and painting. These early Christian and Byzantine paintings are called icons, which comes from the Greek word for image, i.e. they are sacred images. Because they're sacred, the icons would be copied again and again. Certain images were also believed to have miraculous powers, which would give them even higher status. Because of this, they would be copied, and because they were copied, these images became very conventionalized. There is no concern to make these people individuals. They are types. This is especially clear in the two angels in the background, which look like mirror images of each other. There's no intention to portray a particular likeness. Furthermore, these paintings, just like the mosaic before it, are meant to serve as devotional images. They're not pleasurable diversions like we see in Roman mosaics or paintings. Because of that, illusionism is not a concern. The space is flat, and the figures are again pressed uncomfortably close to each other. But again, they don't feel crowded because they're in heaven. They're with God and the Virgin Mary in heaven, and they no longer are constrained by the physical world in the same way. This lack of perspective also is conveyed by the base of the throne on which the Virgin Mary sits. You can see that although we see her head on, the base of the throne is tilted up so that we see the top of it. All of this means that there's no coherent perspectival space that allows us to see the painting as an extension of our own world. This irrational space is even more evident in this icon by Andrei Rublev, which uses what we might call reverse perspective. Instead of showing the vanishing point being at the edge of vision, it is at the source. In other words, the viewer, you can see if you look at the base of the chairs in which the two angels sit on the left and right, that the base of their thrones, the perspective vanishing point comes outwards towards us, not away from us. In other words, the viewer diminishes or vanishes with respect to the subject matter in the painting. We are at the vanishing point, and they are at the source of vision. What this does is it places the viewer in the position of being inferior to the subject matter in the painting. The painting we might consider like a window, but it's a window that opens up onto a spiritual reality that is bigger and more important than our own. We can see some of these same contrasts if we look at sculpture as well. I'm showing you what should be familiar to you now, the contrast between the Riace bronze warrior on the left and the seated sculpture of the pharaoh Khafre on the right. Here we can see that anthropocentric sculpture is dynamic, and it usually employs contrapposto, or movement in space, versus the static, stiff, and sculpture of Khafre on the right. There's a lack of movement and a lack of roundness in this sculpture. In fact, the sculpture of Khafre might be conceived of as a series of reliefs carved into the block. And if you look at the base of the pedestal, you can see that it's very clearly square, and that each side of the sculpture was carved away from this cubical shape to reveal the image. Whereas in the statue of the Riace bronze, there's no clear square sculptural shape at all. The figure is fully round and occupies space in a dynamic way that corresponds to the way that we move through space ourselves. Again, here we see the same stiffness in the Egyptian sculpture, representing the eschatological view, while we see the beginnings of roundness and movement in the Kouros figure on the right, representing the anthropocentric view. We can also see a difference in expression. Menkare and his wife on the left are impassive. Their gaze is fixed into eternity. And again, these statues are meant to represent the pharaoh and his wife moving into the afterlife. The Kouros, on the other hand, shows just the hint of a smile that says he's pleased with himself. He's pleased to be alive. If we look moving back into the deep past again at the Venus de Willendorf, we see that eschatological sculpture and art also has a tendency to ignore normal proportions for expressive purpose. Here, the sex features of the Venus are exaggerated in order to suggest fertility, and everything that's unrelated to that is minimized. So her hands and her feet are all made very small, and she is in no way given a specific likeness. Her head is reduced to the barest symbol. She is anonymous. The Hellenistic sculpture of the old woman, on the other hand, representing the anthropocentric view, is moving through space, and she is given all the concrete specificity of an individual, even down to her haggard features and her worn body. Size exaggeration is used by the Egyptians here to indicate relative importance. T, the large figure at the left, watches his servants engage in a hippopotamus hunt. Hieratic proportion is used to indicate his superiority over his servants, but he's also shown in the stiff, unnatural pose of the pharaohs, while his servants, who are mere mortals, are shown in lively and active poses. The conceptual presentation of T, where he is shown from multiple perspectives at once, head and limbs in profile, and the torso from the front, shows that he has divine status, while his servants, shown more naturalistically, do not. The exaggeration in these Sumerian votive figures indicates their function. Hieratic proportion, again, represents some difference in rank among the figures, but their large staring eyes help them to, quote-unquote, pray without ceasing, as St. Paul told us, to intercede on behalf of those who remain in the temple, who cannot remain in the temple to pray. These two heads here tell the whole history of Roman art in a sense, and they show this shift from the anthropocentric art that They show the shift from the anthropocentric view of art that began the Roman Empire to the eschatological view of art that ends it. The head at the left is an ancestor portrait from the Republican period, actually just before the beginning of the Roman Empire. And the head at the right is part of a colossal portrait of the Emperor Constantine that stood in his basilica at Rome. The ancestor portrait is in keeping with all the principles of anthropocentric art. It is naturalistic, even to the point of including all the signs and wrinkles of old age. It is also life-size, so it is in keeping with the viewer's perceptual experience. The man's sober expression and tilted head give him a certain humanity and lifelikeness. The portrait of Constantine, on the other hand, is enormous. The head is about 7 feet high, and the entire statue would have been about 40 feet high. Constantine's eyes are large and staring, representing his sleepless justice and authority over his subjects. These large staring eyes are appropriate since the statue would have sat in the apse of the Basilica of Constantine, representing Constantine sitting in judgment. You can see that here in this reconstruction of Constantine's Basilica. The cutaway shows the statue of Constantine as it might have originally appeared, with him sitting on the throne, and you can see, based on how small the people are in relation to the statue and the rest of the building, just how big this sculpture would have been. The statue also has symbolic significance because the apse of the basilica was used as a law court where people with grievances could come and receive justice. So the idea is that it shows that the justice that the judge gives ultimately comes from the emperor himself. The emperor is the one who is sitting in judgment over his subjects. This is a plan of the basilica. You can see the original apse on the far left side, and the vaulted nave. When Constantine legalized Christianity in the 4th century, Christians adopted the basilica plan as the model for their churches because they needed a large public space in which to gather. The basilica that Constantine built in Rome, St. Peter's, is built on this basilica plan. The apse that held the statue of Constantine becomes the location of the altar, which is the judgment seat of God. In other words, going to church is to seek justice from God by confessing wrongdoing and receiving pardon. The early Christians and the Byzantines made this very explicit in their iconography. This mosaic from San Vitale at Ravenna, where we saw the image of the Emperor Justinian earlier, also shows how the basilica plan of the Romans became the Christian church. Christ is shown in the apse, dressed in purple like a Roman emperor, and seated on a globe which symbolizes his authority over the whole world. So he's sitting in judgment over his creation. Christ hands a crown to Saint Vitalis, the martyr for whom the church is named, the patron of the church, to show that he has been found worthy to enter into heaven. We can also look at architecture in terms of the anthropological, eschatological thesis, not just sculpture and painted or two-dimensional decoration. We'll look a little bit more at churches in a second, but first I want to briefly touch on how these relate to Greek and Egyptian architecture to set the stage. Looking here at the Parthenon, we can see that it conforms to the rationalism of Greek art with its clear, logical construction, and especially with its visible and definite relation between load and support. The columns have a definite purpose in holding up the entablature. The floor plan is also logically arranged, with all the rooms and parts subordinated to a clear, simple rectangular shape. By contrast, the same kind of rational structure cannot be seen in Egyptian architecture. The hypostyle hall of the great temple of Amun is overwhelming and somewhat mysterious. The whole cannot be taken in at once. The building dwarfs us, and we can only see parts of it at one time. A similar comparison can be made between the Pantheon at Rome and Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. The Pantheon has a simple geometric structure. It is essentially spherical. Seen in section and plan, this spherical shape is more clear. The diameter of the circular cella, the main body of the temple, is equal to the height of the dome, almost 150 feet. In the section, shown at the left, you can see also the use of ribbing to support the dome, and coffers, which lighten the weight of the dome. These features give a kind of logical justification for how this massive dome is supported. The round plan of the building also emphasizes the human element. Its round shape is borrowed from the Greek tholos, a circular temple. The natural orientation of the building is to the center, so that visitors tend to gravitate to the location directly in the middle under the oculus, the opening in the dome designed to let in light. This dramatically illustrates the humanist motto that man is the center. The temple effectively becomes a celebration of humankind. This centrally planned temple or tholos also provided a prototype for another kind of Christian church, the martyrium, which is essentially a mausoleum or tomb church. You can see that the same basically circular shape is adopted, this time with a higher domed area surrounded by an ambulatory, a walkway which visitors can use to walk around the building. Originally, Constanza, Constantine's daughter, was buried here, and her coffin would have been placed where the altar is now. The church of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, where Constantine moved his capital from Rome, was built by Constantine's successor, the Emperor Justinian, who we saw in the mosaic earlier. The church of Hagia Sophia is also surmounted by a massive dome like the Pantheon. By comparison to the Pantheon, however, the dome of Hagia Sophia is mysterious. With a much larger interior space, the dome seems to float above us, supported only by light, let in through multiple small windows that line the base of the dome. This effect is accomplished by the use of pendentives, which are these hemispherical triangles that allow the weight of the dome to be transferred to 4 piers at the corners. This invention allowed architects to place a round dome on a square base, something that the builders of the Pantheon did not know how to do. The orientation of the building is also not towards the center, but towards the apse, where the altar is, as in the basilica plan. You can see the apse at the far left of this plan. That's where the altar was. The length of the building was used for processions that included the priests and bishops and the emperor carrying up the bread and wine, which would be used in the liturgical celebration. The building does not aggrandize humans, as does the Pantheon, but diminishes them in respect to the omnipotence of God, much in the same way as Byzantine icons do with reverse perspective. The dome and pendentive structure allowed the Byzantine architects to combine 2 different church designs, the longitudinal basilica and the centrally planned church. This allowed them to have the grandeur of a dome, but also maintain the horizontal orientation which was necessary for the celebration of the liturgy. The marriage of the longitudinal and central plans was not always perfect. San Vitale in Ravenna is essentially a centrally planned building, and we see it here both in plan and in a section cutaway drawing. You can see that the apse and the sanctuary extend off the central dome area in order to modify the central plan into a kind of longitudinal orientation. The result is that there's no clear line of sight in the building, echoing the lack of clarity that is seen in the hypostyle hall at Karnak. The building is also encrusted with mosaics which further break up the surface and mask some of the architectural elements. If you think about the shimmering effect that these mosaics would have as you walk around the building, it makes the building more like a jewel rather than just a work of architecture, and thus it lacks the kind of logical clarity that we see in Greek and Roman temples. I'm going to stop here for today, but this gives you, I think, some picture of how we can look at art in terms of both anthropological or humanistic terms, especially in terms of ancient Greek and Roman art, and also in terms of eschatological or religious terms. And we've looked at that in a number of different examples, but especially in terms of early Christian and Byzantine art.